Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all, welcome to episode 36 of Fire Code Tech. On this episode we have Michael Kinsey. On episode 36 of Fire Code Tech we are deep diving into egress modeling, fire engineering outside of the United States, interesting trends and topics in the industry like how computer science and fire protection engineering overlap. I really enjoyed speaking with Michael. He has a wonderful perspective and a truly unique journey in fire and life safety. We talked about prescriptive design, performance-based design, and how that they are used to varying effect in Shanghai and other parts of China as compared to places like the US and the UK. We also break into some really interesting research that Michael is involved with that deals with evacuation procedures from a train. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode and follow us on social media. And please, if you could do us a big favor and rate us on Apple Podcasts, that would help so much. Let's get into the show. Anyways, Michael, well, I just want to thank you so much and welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Well, I always like to get started with getting a sense of, I ask people how they got into the industry, and, it's always a kind of roundabout path, unless you have family members in fire and life safety. But I always like to get started with hearing a little bit about people's origin story. Would you mind telling me about kind of how you found out about fire and life safety?
Sure. So, much like a lot of other people, I think, who perhaps didn't do a fire engineering degree, I kind of fell into fire engineering, as it were. I've done a degree in computer science, and during my final year project of my degree, I was looking at encryption. I was really interested in information security, and I was planning on doing a master's in that topic. And my supervisor at the time said, "Well, would you be interested in doing a PhD?" I said, "Oh yeah, I would be." And then they said, "Well," and this was at the University of Greenwich, where there is the Fire Safety Engineering Group, headed by Professor Ed Gallier. And they said, "Well, we have some funding for doing a PhD. Would you be interested?" And I knew nothing about it. So I said, "Well, can we have a talk?" So we had a talk about the kind of thing they were doing. And eventually ended up doing a PhD looking at understanding how people behave in high-rise buildings, specifically with regards to using lifts for evacuation or elevators, and also using escalators for evacuation. And then how can we model that in an evacuation model? And they wanted someone to understand the behavior and then try and develop some computer models. So that's how I got into the area, I guess. Start my first taste a bit of fire engineering, although it was still very much academic and focused on human behavior and computing. And then after my PhD, I did a postdoc, and then I thought, well, I really want to start looking at how can I apply this and work on some real building designs. That's when I, after attending a number of conferences throughout my PhD and postdoc, I've bumped into various people from the company that I now work for called Arup, and these fire engineers seemed really smart, really passionate, and they had great things to say about Arup. So after my postdoc, I applied to work for Arup and as a fire engineer, and I didn't really know a huge amount. I certainly didn't appreciate the full breadth of things that fire engineers do. I was hugely naive, hugely ignorant, but I knew that fire engineering involved or can involve the use of evacuation models. And that's how I came to work for Arup.
Very cool. I'd like to, just double back The reason I got started with the podcast was kind of because I had started to kind of learn about computer science and a little bit of web programming. So I had to have a little bit of that programming knowledge. So I'm kind of fascinated that you started off with the CS degree and then you stumbled into fire engineering. I think that's a kind of a remarkable through line. But yeah, what kind of I always think that the mindset of people who are involved with computer science and like the problem solving mentality of this role or this career is kind of similar to the problem solving nature of engineers and how they're tasked with a kind of a different issue or a code problem, and they kind of have to figure it out, and it's not always very well defined. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that's just a general comment on. I think that's a fascinating part of your background, this computer science path that you've had in your career.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's huge parallels with computer science and fire engineering. We both disciplines are involved with dealing with problems. They typically attract people who are curious and want to find ways to solve them. Specifically, when I think about my background in programming, programming is essentially looking at a system, deciding how we can break down a system into a series of instructions to do something and simplify it. So then we can do something with it. And I think that's quite a lot what engineers do. We look at some very complex systems, we try to simplify it so we can make sense of it, and then we try to do something with it.
Yeah, I love that process-driven mindset. I try to bring some of that into what I, work and, distilling the process of being a fire protection engineer down to its salient points and try to have better documentation. And I don't know, I think there's just a lot of great lessons from the big tech industry that fire protection seems like it's kind of lagging or it's a little bit old school. And so I always like kind of looking at um, uh, industries that have kind of more cutting edge trends and trying to apply them to fire and life safety. So I really am a big fan of that topic of the Venn diagram of the parallels between these two subjects.
Absolutely. And I think very much now so, where many industries, particularly fire engineering, are trying to look to adopt more digital tools and go through some kind of digital transformation, they become even more similar.
Yeah. And I wanted to pick your brain since you do have some um, like coding background. I always have like a interest in where these different evacuation modeling softwares and just like FDS or the different egress modeling softwares, like kind of what like programming backbone that they have. I saw you had some experience in C++, but and I have some like very rudimentary knowledge of a couple different programming languages, but I didn't know if you had any insight to, like, are these different fire and life safety modeling programs kind of all based on some of the more low level, like C languages? Or I saw, I forget on Twitter you were talking to, I can't remember if it was Wojciech or somebody else about that. Oh yeah, Guillermo Rain was talking about FDS being like some proprietary sort of coding language. I thought that was really fascinating, but I didn't know if you had any exposition on that.
Yeah, so as I understand, and I haven't programmed in FDS, FDS is open source, which means that anyone can go and have a look at it, look at the code, they can update it. And that presents a number of benefits. Of course, you need an active community to start updating it. And I think there is a pretty active community in FDS, certainly in the research field where you get perhaps a PhD student come along, they want to develop a subcomponent of the model. There is an extension of FDS called FDS Evac, which is supposed to be the evacuation model base, that is also open source, and it's an extension of FDS. But I don't think that's hugely used, nowhere near as common as some of the other evacuation models, which are effectively closed systems. They're not open source. So, for example, we have Pathfinder, Steps, Mass Motion, Building Exodus. They tend to be they're developed by they're more classically developed, so they're developed by a bunch of software developers, and then you can't change the code. Interestingly, a lot of the evacuation models are incorporating things like scripting tools within them, so that you can get access to the agent behavior, and you can do some really quite powerful things with them now.
That's very interesting. So, do you have more experience with? I just wanted to speak about the different programs that you have experience in, or the ones that you've used most often, or is it more of the Pathfinder? I think I got to use that one in school a little bit, very base level, like something that you would cringe if you saw, but I think I've at least put one of those models together. But yeah, which one do you have the most reps with?
So within Arup, the evacuation model and pedestrian model called Mass Motion is developed. So we get access to that, and that's probably the most common one that we use within Arup. It's not obligatory that we use this, and sometimes we do use other evacuation models within the company. So, for example, certain approving authorities may request that we use a certain model. So we also have used Steps. Certain teams have used Pathfinder as well. But certainly for my experience, considering I've been, at Arup a number of years, I probably use Mass Motion the most. Before that, I would have used Building Exodus, as that's what most of my PhD and postdoc were involved in developing.
I see. So I wanted to talk a little bit more. You gave a great broad overview of, your time in college and your PhD. But I just am still kind of fascinated that you are working out of Shanghai for Arup. How did you make this? In my mind, it seems like such a big leap to go from Greenwich and all the way over to Shanghai. Like, how did you even find out? Was it just the position with the opening and you saw it and you were like, this sounds like it'll be a good fit? Or I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, to be fair, which I'll try and condense it. I actually used to live in Shanghai after my degree. I actually initially started a PhD with the Fire Safety Engineering group, and I decided that I really fancied more of a break, and I was really interested in Chinese history, and I got offered a chance to go on like a teaching holiday where I would help teach some kids, and I would take them around China, and it was a chance to travel, and yeah, that was a great opportunity. So I went for 2 weeks. I thought, this is a fantastic, really interesting country. I'd love to come back here. So then I decided, well, I'm gonna plan to come here, and not really thinking about what I would do. I came here, I taught English, I learned a bit of Chinese here, and then I decided that I miss the challenge and the interest of doing a PhD. So I contacted my supervisor, Professor Ed Gallier in the University of Greenwich, and said, look, do you have any PhD opportunities again? He said, yep, we do. You can come back. So then I came back, and I always really was interested in China still. So then I did my PhD, my postdoc. I found Arup, and it coincidence that Arup has an office in Shanghai and a number of other places within China. My wife at the time was Chinese and was very interested in coming back to be closer to her family. So that's when the conversations happened after working for Arup. Well, I said, well, do you think it's possible that I could transfer to our a China-based office? And initially, it took a while to organize, to be fair. because I think no other foreigner is transferred to within the fire team is transferred to a mainland China office. Most would typically go to Hong Kong, where the working language is English, or perhaps another country. But I really request I'd like to come here. So it took a little while to organise, but Arup were absolutely fantastic. The Arup UK fire leadership were fantastic, as were the East Asia leadership. And it was a bit of so there wasn't an opening as such. I actually requested to come here, and there was when I look back on it now, and this was over 5 years ago, there was some elements of uncertainty because the working language within the office here is Chinese. So there was what would I do, and what projects could I get involved in, and things like that. But here we are, 5.5 years later, and I'm still here. And it's been an amazing whirlwind ride. And I think I'm perhaps the only foreigner fire engineer in the whole of China, not just within Arup, but within the whole country. I've never met another foreigner fire engineer in China.
Wow. That's beyond remarkable. I mean, it's a pretty wild story. I think that's awesome and fascinating. I'm sure that was quite an adjustment to come into department and have it be so foreign and so to be it's not like you're an outsider or anything, but you're definitely I don't know. There are a few times in my life where I've had that feeling to be like so engrossed in another culture like that. So it sounds really intimidating to me. So I'm impressed, I guess. I guess is what I'm trying to say, that you were able to go into a situation like that and make it work. That's awesome. That's cool to hear about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think you need a bit of I think whichever country, if you were going to transfer, which I would say I would highlight, Arup is really great for supporting you if you want to go and travel. You want to go to another country to work for a few years. They have a system called long-term assignment where you can go to a country, say for 2 years, to get some experience. Then you go back to your home country. I would say whichever country you go to, you're going to need a certain level of courage and a certain level of ignorance. Ignorance may need to protect you from thinking about all the things that could go wrong. And I certainly coming to China, and when you think about the job of a fire engineer, our job is to communicate with people, to read codes. Like I come to China, the codes are in Chinese, and people are mainly communicating in Chinese, which I can't do, or I couldn't do very much at the time. I didn't even think about that. So it's been an absolute fascinating ride.
Wow. So how fast did it take you to feel like that you were navigating these waters with great proficiency? This it's the whole role is so heavy, like you said, in communication and based on conveying like a set of design principles. How long did it take you to feel like you had it licked?
I don't think I've ever felt like I have it licked. And you know what? Even in the UK, I constantly felt I was presented with new challenges. There was so little repetition. Every building was new. Every design team was very slightly different. So even where we had like a repeat item of work, it was different. So I think that trains you up to be adaptable. And I think as a fire engineer, you have to be adaptable. And I think those traits just got magnified when I came to China. I had to be adaptable. The way things work in China is very, very different in fire engineering terms. And you just have to I should also highlight that I was supported by a fantastic bunch of fire engineers in the Arup Fire China team, who were really, really helpful. They're not just my colleagues, they're my friends, they're effectively my extended family here, because I don't have the classical support networks that you have around you when you're in your home country.
Yeah. I my only situation which I could even draw parallel to was I moved like north in the U.S. like 7 hours, and I remember the kind of detached feeling I had when I had a flat tire or something and I couldn't call on a family member and I didn't have like a real consolidated friend group, but they still could, drive and come see me. So I don't. That's pretty kind of wild to think about that whole support structure of your life kind of uprooting and finding your way someplace else. That's awesome. Um, I wanted to talk about, and you touched on it a little bit, like the codes and standards process in China and like the different kind and how you navigate that. I'm aware of how it works in the U.S., but I'm always fascinated to speak with individuals who operate in a different set of codes and standards or a different process, because I found that even when it's the same, it's different. So
Yeah, so I think so just from my experience, obviously I've worked in the UK. I've worked on projects in the Middle East, adopting NFPA US standards. And then now I've got experience in China. And I would say within China, the broad principles of what we're trying to achieve, regardless of which country we're in, is the same. We're trying to achieve life safety and maybe some extra business continuity within the fire safety engineering process. The method on how they achieve that and the prescriptive requirements vary. And also the approvals process varies quite a bit within China. You always have someone or a body that approves your designs, but they operate in very different ways. In addition, China is massive. I think China has a population which is twice the size of the US plus Europe combined.
yeah,
So what that kind of means is that you might work on one project in certain location, and they'll require certain things, even adopting one fire safety code. But then you go somewhere else and they might interpret it in a slightly different way, or they might even have their own fire safety standards as well.
wow, that's interesting. Yeah, in the U.S. and I'm sure in other parts of the world, there's a kind of gradients of the same code, but to wholesale adopt different fire safety standards within China, that's very interesting. Yeah, I definitely don't have the real scale for like the massiveness of China and like the population. It is kind of baffling to me. I mean, just staring at the numbers of the what is it, the 1.3 billion or probably plus billion people in China. It's kind of overwhelming to think about, but that's fascinating.
Yeah, and culturally is hugely diverse. And I think once you begin to understand the language and you start communicating and seeing people, you recognize how culturally diverse it is. Even though it's all China, there's actually lots of different subcultures within China.
Very interesting. That makes sense. So I wanted to get into a little bit of and we spoke about it a little bit, but my perceived my perception of your specialty in kind of fire and life safety, which is like evacuation modeling. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I would say I have an expertise, a level of expertise in understanding how people behave, and then applying that within the design process. So, for example, through the use of evacuation models or hand calculations, or just thinking about what people might do and using that to inform design.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was listening to your episode with Wojciech on the Fire Science Show, and I didn't make it through quite all of it, but I think like at least 40 minutes, and I was really enjoying the you speaking about some of the different biases and other topics that you have researched about as far as people and how they behave in fires. So some of that, I've had a class that talks about egress and human behavior in fire and pre-evacuation time, and but still some of these concepts felt really really new to me. I didn't know if you would speak a little bit more about just generally broad overview some of these biases and some of the other different egress topics that you have researched?
Sure. So the bias research, the cognitive biases during looking at human behavior and evacuation decision making, sort of came about through discussions and being recommended to read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, which is sort of the grandfather of cognitive biases. And then we thought, well, how can this looks really interesting, and we think there could be something here, and applying it to how people behave during fire evacuations. So we got together a team. So it was myself, we had Professor Steve Gwynn at Movement Strategies in the UK, we had Dr. Max Kinneteder, who's now at the NRCC in Canada, and Dr. Erica Kuligowski, who was at NIST, is now at RMIT in Australia. And we thought, well, how can we let's put together some ideas and just think about what we could do here. So we started we first looked at what is the current literature and what are the common things people do in fires that we know and it's been documented. And then we thought, well, maybe we could instead of just say these behaviors happen, maybe we could look through the lens of a cognitive bias, and that might help us decide why the behaviors occur. So that was one of the first steps. And then we started thinking, well, what are some of the other things we know people do, and how could we link that to a bias? And we eventually came to look at classifying them according to the protective action decision model, to try and identify trends in the cognitive biases. To highlight what I think cognitive biases are effectively where people over focus on certain information at the expense of other more relevant information. So it's a fallacy in the decision-making process, and generally it leads to a negative outcome. It doesn't have to lead to a negative outcome. It can actually lead to a positive outcome, but there's the issue is with the decision-making process itself. So we identified a number of biases which we think could occur during fire evacuations, and we can link them to known behaviors and suggest some new behaviors. So we hope this might offer a new way, certainly for future research, to consider why people make certain decisions. Maybe they're being biased in some way.
Yeah, that's a great piece of exposition on the incipients of your research. I really took it to heart, and when you're kind of talking about the primary bias of if you have an exit that you always use, what's the chance that when something goes wrong that you're not going to use that exit, or if when you try something the first time and it works out, then you have a tendency to always fail to that decision, or you stop thinking about the choice. And I can just take a look at my life very quickly and see that I always use the same exits, and that even extrapolating it to other parts of life, like you go to a restaurant and you have something you like there and then you don't want to change it. It's like you can see very easily how these biases kind of seep out into all the different parts of your life. So it made a very vivid picture for me when you were speaking about that with Wojciech.
Yeah, the world is really, really complicated. You think even the most simple decisions can actually the underlying mechanics can be really complicated to come to a decision. So as we can't process all the information as humans, so we have to simplify the world. Much like an engineer, we need to simplify things to make decisions. Every day when we have decisions, we have to simplify them, and we can do that using something called heuristics, where we develop rules of thumb. Like, for example, if I look out the window and I see some clouds, I think it's going to rain. Perhaps I don't have time, or I don't have access to my phone to check the weather forecast. So we do this. This simplification can take the form of adopting something called substitution, where you get a complicated question and you substitute it for a more simple one, and then you answer the more simple one. So a good example is if I ask you, how happy are you with your life? This is actually a really complicated question. You could consider all manner of things.
Yeah.
But what you might do in your subconscious is think, well, how happy am I recently? And if you're happy recently, you'll say, yeah, I'm happy with my life. So you've done that substitution to answer a more complex question.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. I was really kind of resonated with your bit of information where you're talking about the difference between the active brain and the sort of subconscious brain. And something that I think about a lot in life is, trying to free up the subconscious brain, which has all the metaphorical horsepower, and the active brain being the one that takes more energy, and it's kind of more stressful for the body to engage. But as a professional, like we were talking about, in the first 5 years of my career, I've been just, trying to get to the point where some of these, the more difficult past or tasks of being a fire protection engineer have started to become more subconscious and kind of lighten the mental load of it all. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of a random tangent, but I was just thinking about that. Your discussion of the subconscious and the conscious, and how these biases or these different actions are really deep seated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so after initially looking at cognitive bias in fire evacuations, we decided, well, actually, you could apply this to fire engineers practicing fire engineering. So we actually wrote another paper looking at cognitive biases in fire engineering and proposed some potential ways that we might be able to mitigate some of these biases. So we've come up with as well as identify biases which that fire engineers might exhibit. We then decided, well, how can we stop them? Because I really like doing practical papers. I don't like just writing papers saying, oh, we've identified something, thanks, bye bye. We really wanted to say, well, how might we be able to mitigate some of them?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I think it's interesting to try to see the common pitfalls or the rule of thumb things in industry, or just more baseline implications or biases of what people do, and common mistakes. And I'm a big fan of research, not just for research, but to solve a practical problem, and make the world better, and further fire and life safety. But yeah, I wanted to ask about a little bit more of your kind of project work experience. I didn't know if you had a recent or maybe historic project that you had worked on that you would be able to share with the listeners, to give them and to give me like a greater sense of the kind of work that you're involved in.
Sure. So I'll talk about the projects that I've been in, or some of the projects I've been involved in China. I would say, by and large, the scales of the building that I work on in China are some of them are absolutely huge. They involve many superlatives in tallest, biggest, or something like that. There's so much being developed in China at the moment that it's so big, it's so tall. It presents some really interesting challenges from a fire engineering perspective. To be specific, one of the first projects I worked on in China was for the largest Starbucks in the world at the time,
Wow.
which was the Shanghai Starbucks roastery. That presented a lot of interesting challenges from fire engineering perspective. Most notably, I think, for anyone who's been to a Starbucks roastery, and they're developing more of them now, they have this big piece of equipment which roasts the coffee within the actual shop, and you can see this. It's really interesting. It's really fascinating. But this equipment obviously is not typical for a Starbucks coffee shop. So we had to consider how does that factor in within the fire strategy, and how does it factor in, how they want to use the space.
That's very interesting. I'm a huge fan of coffee, and fan of Starbucks too. But that's I was just speaking today about with somebody, funny enough, that was talking about a huge coffee roasting process and some sort of offset of some hazardous material with making a cold brew or something. If you had a giant roastery. But so that's interesting that you bring up that process of that fire roasting those beans. But a huge coffee fan. But that's very interesting. So you talked a little bit about like a fire like strategy. It sounds a little bit more informal than what I'm used to, and my sense of the fire and life safety codes abroad is that a lot of other places in the world are far more performance based than the U.S. But yeah, I don't know if you have some sense of like prescripted weighted versus performance based design. It sounds like with the scale of what you're dealing with in China that you would almost have to be well versed in performance based design, because it doesn't sound like these buildings can fit into any sort of uh, easy prescriptive cookie cutter model.
Yeah, you'd be surprised actually. I would say that by and large, and I come from the UK, I would say performance-based designs um, is far more common in the UK and perhaps Europe as a whole than say China. There's a bit more, there's far more risk aversion to using performance-based design. I mean, this said, just to clarify, when I say performance-based design, most buildings will be a combination of performance-based design and prescriptive design. And you'll perhaps use performance-based design for a very specific aspect of your building. So if we think about China, certainly compared to say the UK, it's not as prevalent to use performance-based design. This said, there are certain situations where it's more common or it's more standard to use performance-based designs purely because of the requirements within the prescriptive fire codes. So, for example, certain things like airports typically have large open plan areas with very big fire compartments. And a unique thing about the China fire code is its concept of fire compartments is different to the rest of the world. So the definition of a fire compartment, say in most of the rest of the world, is a room that's enclosed in fire resistant construction. And we would refer to that as a fire compartment. Within China, the concept of a fire compartment, which is the Chinese as Xiaofeng Fengqu, is actually slightly different. It's actually an area or group of rooms which you enclose in a 3 hours fire resistant construction.
Wow.
And there are limitations on the area. So it might be 4,000 meters squared, 5,000, whatever it is, depending on the use. Now, as well as divide up your building according to these fire compartment sizes, each fire compartment is almost treated like a separate building in terms of egress and firefighting. So each fire compartment needs at least 2 separate escape stairs or exits, and also a firefighting lift. So what that means is that you're typically going to get more stairs or requirement for more stairs per building in China than perhaps you would in other places, because every fire compartment have to be almost like a self-contained unit.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's really different than how the U.S. would address a building of. You were saying like 4,000 to 5,000 square meters for the English unit users. That's like 4,000 square meters is about 43,000 square feet. So that's we work on buildings all the time that are like to be limited combustible construction that are well over 60,000 square feet, or could be in that similar range without any rated construction like that. So it's kind of interesting for me to hear that there's only very specific situations in which you would ever have a 3-hour fire separation, which is a pretty significant fire separation.
Absolutely, and that's for any class. I should say those numbers I mentioned about the area limits, they change according to the building types.
Sure.
So the higher the risk, the smaller they are. But in a similar fashion to US and UK fire codes, when you provide sprinklers, they provide added benefits to your design. So you can perhaps increase travel distances, you can increase your compartment size, and things like that.
Yeah, that was an interesting point you made about, how performance-based design is used, but really in very specific situations that have, well, I don't know if excessive is the right word, but more strict um, limitations on the use case, maybe is a better way to say it. But in the U.S., like I've barely used any performance-based design my entire career with like hundreds of projects designed. I maybe have seen like, well, I don't know, maybe one or two, and it's really only very specific in the U.S. Like, there's a big added benefit for smoke control systems, or if you have a really tight egress component in a historic building or something, if you basically if you need it in a pinch, in some of the larger jurisdictions you could use performance-based design, but in some of the smaller areas in the US they wouldn't know what to do with it. If you brought them a report, I'm sure probably similarities for you as well, but yeah, I've not had much experience with it, so it's interesting for me to hear about that.
Yeah, I think to touch on performance-based design within China, typically, if we have a very complex project or something which deviates from the code, then there is a standard method of assessing a performance-based design. And in terms of approval, they would have to go through something called an expert panel review. And what that is, and that's anywhere, wherever you are in China, they have to go through an expert panel review. And that's a series of maybe 7 experts, maybe not from necessarily the jurisdiction where the project is, but they might be, there's a pool of them nationally. And then they would all review the performance-based analysis or the design, and then they would give their feedback. So, I mean, in the UK, we might call that something like a third-party review. However,
Hmm.
here it's 7 people, all independent, looking at this.
Wow.
So it's pretty heavy stuff when you go through
That sounds
performance-based design.
rigorous.
Yes. So it adds also variation, and I think this is a wider issue with adoption of performance-based design. When you get lots of people involved, you can get designs being pulled in various directions.
Yeah,
It is a very rigorous process through checking. And I think the adoption of performance-based design is, there's some common challenges regardless of which country you're in. Ensuring consistency and ensuring high quality, making sure that it's not being misused, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Challenges that we face here as well.
wow. That's yeah, sometimes I worry that enough oversight is being done, but in that instances I would be worried about the issue being taken too far with 7. I mean, yeah, I mean it's difficult enough to get one very experienced authority having jurisdiction to, with the third party review to in a big enough jurisdiction to buy off on a code design, but 7, it seems like that would be very difficult to get consensus on the methodology and the assumptions used. But well, I think that's really interesting.
No, you're absolutely right. It is. It's certainly interesting. It's been really interesting for me because some of the experts the experts range in their backgrounds. They're not all, people with expertise in evacuation modeling and fire modeling and things like that. So it adds another string to considerations when we're looking at performance-based design.
So I've seen some pictures on social media of you doing evacuations and different kind of different simulations of evacuations from trains. I think that's super interesting. We were talking before the podcast got started about Brian Hoskins at Oklahoma State University, and in school he used to do some different egress drills on us in the student union, which is kind of a big building with, and he would record the students' movements, given a set of instructions, and kind of see how we all kind of took a different winding way out of the student union. But yeah, I would love to hear about what and why you're doing these evacuations from trains?
So the evacuation train research is it's a really interesting project. It's a commercially funded project. It's not a government funded project or anything like that. And essentially, we're working with Chinese train manufacturers to conduct evacuation research, understand a bit more about how people might behave during an evacuation of a train, look at some of the influencing factors, and then decide, well, now we know this. First of all, can we develop models, evacuation models of them that are fairly realistic? Because if we can, then that means that we can use evacuation modeling as a tool to inform the design. And then the next stage is, well, how can we improve the design of these trains?
Very cool, very cool. I'm a huge fan of trains, even though the U.S. is fairly lacking in that kind of transportation. At least there's not been much of it done in a lot of the country in a long time, but I always enjoy when I get to go to other places in the world that have more developed train systems.
Yeah, it's I'd say China is the mecca of high-speed trains development. It has the biggest high-speed train network, and it's developing not only the network but the trains on them as well. It's so convenient living in such a large country that you can get access to really fast trains. We have the Shanghai going from Shanghai to Beijing, and that can do it in like 4.5 hours. And I think that's a top speed of 350 kilometers per hour.
Wow. That is impressive. That's impressive. Well, I wanted to ask a little bit about your research at the Shanghai Institute of, or not research, but your guest professorship at the Shanghai Institute of Technology. What are you teaching some courses there, or what's kind of that role look like for you?
Yeah, so I'm a guest professor at the Shanghai Institute of Technology, and I lecture on the Masters of Safety Engineering course they have there, which is a general purpose safety engineering course. It's not focused on fire, and I give a lecture on. I give a number of lectures, a part of a wider fire safety module on human behavior and evacuation modeling. So we teach them about the things people do during fire evacuations, and then we teach them how to use evacuation models.
Cool. Very neat. Very neat. That's always interested in spreading the word about anybody teaching safety or fire safety. So I always like hearing about people who have teaching roles. I enjoy just talking and spreading the word about that stuff. Um, yeah, so I always like to kind of round out the interview with so a couple professional development topics. Anytime I get a chance to catch somebody who is passionate about what they do, I like to pick their brain about the resources they like and what they see as trending in the industry. But yeah, I just wanted to start off with asking is in your role or just more broadly as a professional, what kind of trends do you see in fire and life safety or business in general?
I think I see kind of two parallel strands of fire engineering. There's increased development in refining and increasing the scope of prescriptive requirements in fire codes, and we need this because we're using ever new materials on projects. The prescriptive fire codes are trying to be more flexible to accommodate different building designs, which is fantastic. At the same time, we're developing ever more sophisticated tools to conduct performance-based analysis. So, CFD models, evacuation models, structural fire engineering models, they're all becoming more sophisticated. I think so there's kind of two things developing, which is amazing. I think where there is a bit of something which needs to be developed more is the interface between the two. So, identifying, giving clear, tangible guidance as to when it may be acceptable to use performance-based design. I still feel in certain circles there's a bit of distrust for performance-based design. There's a fear of misuse. There's also a fear of wide variation in not in only using it, but also in approvals. So I think in the future, I would like to see a better marrying of the two, with more tangible, clear guidance, because at the moment it's quite high level, and I think that creates some uncertainty. And when you're faced with uncertainty, the warm feeling of prescriptive guidance is typically what people veer towards.
Wow, that's a great perspective. I've not anybody heard that, or at least worded in that way before. I've heard a lot of people who are, hardcore performance-based design, or, some old fogies that are, party line prescriptive design, and that's just the way it needs to be. But I like that sentiment that, we need to find a better way to marry the two and to, provide the best option, but not be afraid of performance-based design if we can be assured that there is good engineering practice involved. I think that's a wonderful sentiment.
Exactly. I think it's about fitness for purpose. It's about being able to provide flexibility in the tools we use so we can help design these fantastic buildings. I think everyone's on the same page with our motivations. It's just the means by which we do that, I think, that we need to do better at.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Yeah, on this professional development topic, where do you like to go get your information as a professional? Where do you go to consume content, or just look for resources to learn about fire and life safety, or just business in general?
I think when I first came into the field, I used, looking at fire research journals, which are fantastic. The magazines from, say, the SFPE, NFPA, the SFP handbook, which is an amazing resource, and various other guidance documents like that. I would say more recently, certainly within the last few years for me, there's a lot more informal education and learning material online, which anyone can get access to for free. Loads of researchers commonly post, links to their papers or things that they're thinking about on social media like Twitter. There's now podcasts, like yours and the Fire Science Show, which provide a great, fascinating way for you to learn about all manner of topics that perhaps you wouldn't normally be exposed to in your everyday jobs. So I think the key is, variety, and find a source that really you can connect with, on a personal level, because you have to find it interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that. It's all about in what way are you going to be the most likely to sustain, because that's the way that you're going to keep up to date. That's a big reason why I wanted to start the podcast, is because that is the way that I consume new information the easiest. With your podcast with Wojciech, I listen to so many podcasts that I'll just turn it up to 1.5 times speed, and my brain just kind of whizzes away on my commute to work. And I absolutely love that is something that's becoming more prevalent, are these kind of alternative, more candid conversations about what we do, because I think it's so fascinating. But those are all great tips, Michael. Well, Michael, I want to thank you so much for spending some time today speaking with me about fire and life safety. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.